Hi everybody, thanks for joining me once again as I continue to work my way through Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ, one chapter at a time. I'm about to go through Chapter 5, The Scientific Evidence. And just as with every chapter so far, Strobel begins Chapter 5 with an anecdote from his own personal life, from his career as a crime reporter for the Chicago Tribune. And Chapter 5 begins with a recounting of the story of Jeffrey MacDonald. Jeffrey MacDonald was accused of murdering his wife and two young daughters, and Strobel describes a lunch he had with Jeffrey MacDonald while his trial was ongoing. The jury was taking a break, and Strobel and MacDonald were having lunch, and he said that he describes MacDonald as being very relaxed, almost unnervingly calm about the whole thing. And Strobel asks MacDonald if he's worried that he'll be convicted of these horrendous crimes, and MacDonald says no, he's confident that he won't be convicted. He says, those people, they'll never convict me. And then, somewhat unconvincingly, he asserts that he is innocent after all. Well, not too long after Strobel's lunch with him, Jeffrey MacDonald was found guilty, convicted of the murders, and sentenced to life in prison. Now, the linchpin of the case against MacDonald was scientific evidence, appropriately enough for this chapter. MacDonald's defense, his story of the murder of his wife and children, was that intruders, drug-crazed intruders, had broken into their home and had attacked him and stabbed him and also murdered his wife and his daughters. But this story wound up not being able to withstand scientific scrutiny. Investigators found that there had been no signs of a life or death struggle at the scene of the murder. And then they used blood typing and microscopic analysis of fibers from MacDonald's pajamas that he had worn that night to establish that there had been no intruder in the house that night, and in fact that the most likely culprit in the killings was MacDonald himself. Strobel tells us that story to establish that scientific evidence can be of a great help in establishing the details of a particular event, and just as it helped to establish what actually happened in the case of Jeffrey MacDonald and the murders of his family, it can also be used to help establish the details of the New Testament. Of course, we don't use blood typing or fiber analysis, we use archaeology. By studying artifacts, archaeologists can learn a lot about what life in first century Palestine, where all these Bible stories in the New Testament took place, was actually like. Strobel wonders whether archaeology confirms or contradicts the claims of the Bible, and although there's hardly any point at this juncture, he asserts his own skepticism, again, somewhat unconvincingly, and claims that he doesn't want to hear more of the same in terms of exaggerated claims from Christians about what archaeology tells us about the New Testament. He wants just solid, reasoned, reliable archaeological evidence and reasonable conclusions drawn from that evidence. That's what he says he wants. So we move to the fourth interview of the book, his fourth expert, and this expert is John McCrae, PhD. He's the author of a textbook on New Testament archaeology called Archaeology in the New Testament. He has been an advisor on A&E's Mysteries of the Bible series. You ever watch it? I've watched a couple episodes of that. Not exactly what I would call straight journalism or science, but an interesting show. He is a professor of the New Testament and archaeology at Wheaton College. He's a former research associate and trustee of the W.F. Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem. He's a former trustee of the American Schools of Oriental Research. He's on the editorial boards of Archaeology in the Biblical World and the Bulletin for Biblical Research. He has supervised excavations in Israel and ancient Roman sites in England and Wales, and he retraced much of the Apostle Paul's journey through the Roman Empire during his travels and ministry. So Strobel settles in on the cozy couch, quote unquote, that he finds in McCrae's office and begins the interview. And as they begin, McCrae asserts that archaeology can only confirm or refute the accuracy of the New Testament's setting and incidental details. And he says, quote, "It doesn't confirm that what Jesus Christ said is right. Spiritual truths cannot be proved or disproved by archaeological discoveries." The next section of the chapter is entitled, What Else? Digging for the Truth. I think Strobel was legally obligated to title one section of his archaeology chapter, Digging for the Truth. Strobel explains the value of confirming the details of a person's testimony, and he says, quote, if the person giving the testimony was wrong in those details, this casts considerable doubt on the veracity of his or her entire story. However, if the minutiae check out, this is some indication, not conclusive proof, but some evidence that maybe the witness is being reliable in his or her overall account. And here's what John McCrae says about how well the New Testament stands up to archaeological scrutiny. Quote, oh, there's no question the credibility of the New Testament is enhanced. Speaking of that credibility, the next section is titled Luke's Accuracy as a Historian. McCrae talks about how accurate Luke is. He says Luke is educated and eloquent. McCrae cites an example of how scholars once doubted the accuracy of one of Luke's details, that detail being that Lysanias had been the tetrarch of Abilene in the year 27, only to see that Luke's account was possible because archaeologists discovered evidence that there were actually two government officials named Lysanias, one who was the tetrarch of Abilene, and the other, the better known one, who was the ruler of Chalcis in the previous century. So there were two guys named Lysanias, meaning that Luke's account was actually possible. And there are other archaeological finds that have confirmed details in Luke, like his use of the term politarchs. Archaeology has also suggested possible solutions to the contradiction of Luke depicting Jesus healing the blind Bartimaeus on his way into the city of Jericho, while Mark tells the same story, but the healing takes place as Jesus was walking out of the city of Jericho. And according to McCrae, the explanation for that could be that the city of Jericho had been destroyed and relocated and resettled multiple times, and there were actually multiple sites, at least 4 sites in the same general vicinity, that were considered to be part of the city of Jericho. So Jesus could have been exiting one of those sites and entering another as this episode took place. I personally think that's a reach, but I suppose it is possible given the archaeological evidence, and that's good enough for McCrae and also for Strobel. Strobel suggests that since Luke has been shown to be reliable in these sorts of details, he should also be seen as a credible source overall, including for the more incredible portions of the Jesus story, like the miracles and the resurrection. From the reliability of Luke, we move to the reliability of John and Mark. Now, McCrae cites similar examples to those he just cited about Luke, examples of objections from scholars and historians to the accuracy of John and Mark being explained away, or at least creating enough space so that you can fit a rationalization in there to sort of explain it away. And he says that the Gospels of John and Mark have also held up as reliable in their geographical details, the local lifestyle and details of place, things like this. The reliability of Luke and John and Mark, to my mind, it certainly does nothing to hurt the case that Strobel is trying to make, the authenticity of the New Testament, but it's an awful lot of work just to keep from being pushed off the starting line. You know what I mean? It's like, even if I grant you that the New Testament is accurate in its incidental details, that the towns that it mentions were all there where they were supposed to be, and the government officials were all who the New Testament writers say they were, if you're arguing for the supernatural claims about Jesus, if you're arguing that Jesus not only existed but was the Son of God and the Messiah and was killed and resurrected and that he is able to forgive our sins through his death. I mean, if you're arguing for the truth of Christianity, you still have a long way to go. Establishing the incidental accuracy of the Gospels doesn't get you anywhere. You're still right at zero. You've done nothing to establish the more outrageous claims about Jesus, which to Christians are the most important ones. And it's also important to point out that skepticism from myself and from others who question the authenticity of the Gospels and Christianity doesn't come from how the Gospels handle the incidental details. It comes from the nature of those claims themselves, from the far-fetched nature of the claims about Jesus, like that he was the Messiah, that he was resurrected, that he worked miracles. Luke may have been a very intelligent man, and a very scrupulous historian in general. But does that mean we should believe Luke when he tells us that a man was killed and then rose from the dead? I mean, I'm a pretty down-to-earth guy. I don't have a reputation among my friends as someone who makes up stories or exaggerates. So if I go to hang out with my buddies Matt and Rob tonight, and I tell them that on the way from my house to theirs, I was abducted by aliens, should they believe me? Of course not. They shouldn't believe me, because the fact that I've been reliable in the past is irrelevant. The outrageousness of my claim demands skepticism, regardless of my track record. And also, let's keep in mind that it's entirely possible for someone to be as eloquent and erudite as McCrae describes Luke as being, and to still say and believe things that are not true. Take for one example, Arthur Conan Doyle, one of my favorite writers, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. A brilliant man, a fantastic writer, educated, intelligent, with great respect for the scientific method, as is evidenced in the Holmes stories. He believed in fairies. Now we get into some of the really good parts of this chapter. Strobel poses several puzzles to McCrae that he hopes archaeological evidence can solve, puzzles of the New Testament. And the first puzzle is the census. Luke, that old reliable historian who was careful to get every detail right, writes that Joseph and Mary, while Mary was very pregnant with Jesus, were required to travel from Nazareth, where they lived, to Bethlehem in order to take part in a worldwide census. And the biblical reference to this census is Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, and it reads like this. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, every one into his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. Strobel questions McCrae on the practice of the government forcing citizens to return to their birthplaces for the census. And McCrae argues that this is actually a very well-established practice, that the government apparently did this all the time. And as evidence, he reads a passage from a government order dated in the year 104 that says, quote, "Seeing that the time has come for the house-to-house census, it is necessary to compel all those who for any cause whatsoever are residing out of their provinces to return to their own homes, that they may both carry out the regular order of the census and may also attend diligently to the cultivation of their allotments." Now, McCrae claims this quote from this 2nd century government order as verification that the Roman Empire carried out censuses in this way, requiring people to return to their hometowns. And then he cites another document a little earlier from the year AD 48, which establishes that the entire family was required to do this, to participate in the census, which would have included the pregnant Mary in Joseph's case. And then McCrae argues that the census referred to in Luke was specifically the census of Quirinius, which took place in the year 6 or 7. This is a very popular argument from Christian apologists talking about the census. They almost all claim that the census mentioned in Luke is the census of Quirinius. Strobel ends this section on the census by saying, quote, "I could conclude with confidence that censuses were held during the time frame of Jesus' birth, and that there is evidence people were indeed required to return to their hometowns," which I still thought was odd. Well, not so fast, at least. The census described by Luke requires Joseph, who was living in Nazareth was his hometown, to return to Bethlehem. And why is Joseph required to do this? Because, according to Luke, quote, "because he was of the house and lineage of David." David lived 1,000 years before the time of Joseph and Mary and Jesus. David was not Joseph's father or his grandfather or his great-grandfather. David was Joseph's ancestor. That government order read by McCrae requires citizens, quote, "residing out of their provinces to return to their own homes." In other words, if you're traveling, if you've been out of town, come home, time for the census. Joseph's home was in Nazareth, and that's where this census would have required him to be. There's no record anywhere, anytime of a census that required people to return to the homes of their ancestors from 1,000 years before. The census described by Luke is not the census of Quirinius. No census like that described by Luke ever took place, as far as we know. And it's strange how a historian as erudite and reliable as Luke would get something like that so wrong. The second puzzle, puzzle 2, the existence of Nazareth. Strobel notes that many skeptics question whether or not Nazareth, the hometown of Jesus and also of Joseph, even existed during Jesus' lifetime. He notes that Nazareth isn't mentioned in the Old Testament. It's never mentioned by Paul or in the Talmud or by Josephus or indeed by any other historian before the 4th century. McCrae's explanation for this is that there are early references to Nazareth dating back to the year 70, which is still decades after the life of Jesus, but nevertheless, when the temple at Jerusalem had been destroyed after the fall of Jerusalem, and priests had to be reassigned from the temple, and there's apparently an early record from AD 70 reporting that one of the priests had been sent to Nazareth. So Nazareth must have existed by the year 70 at least. And McCrae says there are no significant references to it outside of the Gospels because Nazareth was a very, very small settlement. And it just wasn't big enough to be worth mentioning by anybody. Personally, I think this is a very fine argument. The only problem with it, at least from where McCrae and Lee Strobel are standing, is that it contradicts how Nazareth is described in the Gospels. Observe. This is Matthew chapter 2, verses 22 and 23. But when he heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea in the room of his father Herod, he was afraid to go thither. Notwithstanding, being warned of God in a dream, he turned aside into the parts of Galilee. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled that he was spoken by the prophets, he shall be called a Nazarene. This next verse is Luke chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. And in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God unto a city of Galilee, named Nazareth, to a virgin espoused to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. Next, Luke chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. And all went to be taxed, every one into his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David. We just heard that one. And then here's another one from Luke chapter 2, verses 39 and 40. And when they had performed all things according to the law of the Lord, they returned into Galilee to their own city of Nazareth. And the child grew and waxed strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. So in other words, not just in those references, but I looked it up anywhere in the New Testament when Nazareth is described, if it's not just called Nazareth, it's always the city of Nazareth. It's never a town, it's never a village, and those are words that do appear often throughout the New Testament, so it's not as if everything is just generically called a city. There are also references to towns and villages, but never Nazareth. Nazareth is always a city. And not only is the Nazareth of the New Testament a city, but it's a fairly well-known one, because remember John chapter 1 verses 45 and 46. Philip findeth Nathanael and saith unto him, We have found him of whom Moses in the law and the prophets did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And Nathanael said unto him, Can there any good thing come out of Nazareth? Philip saith unto him, Come and see. So either Nazareth is, as the Gospels describe it, a city with the sort of reputation that led Nathanael to scoff at the notion of anything good coming from it, or it's the insignificant little settlement that McCrae describes that just wasn't mentioned, wasn't noticed by history. It can't be both of those things. And in order to refute the claim that Nazareth didn't exist in the time of Jesus, McCrae has to contradict the Bible. Puzzle 3, the slaughter at Bethlehem. The Gospel of Matthew contains the only reference to the slaughter of the innocents by Herod the Great, and I do mean the only reference. And that reference reads, quote, Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, and sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. That's Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. Strobel asks McCrae whether or not this event ever even happened, considering the fact that, as I just said, that reference from Matthew that I just read is the only reference anywhere to this ever happening. There's not a single reference to it anywhere else. McCrae answers with a variation of the same argument he just used for Nazareth. He basically says that the slaughter of the innocents is completely absent from history because it just wasn't that big of a deal. And McCrae says, quote, "First, Bethlehem was probably no bigger than Nazareth. So how many babies of that age would there be in a village of 500 or 600 people? Not thousands, not hundreds, although certainly a few." By the way, the estimate I'm familiar with of how many there would have been is maybe a few dozen. I find it interesting that McCrae describes Bethlehem as being, quote, "no bigger than Nazareth," and yet for some reason Bethlehem wasn't totally ignored by history for 400 years. Good luck to anyone trying to construct a consistent view of Nazareth based on what John McCrae says in this book. When we talk about the slaughter of the innocents in Matthew, let's not forget the context in which this story takes place. Remember that the Magi, the wise men, had gone to visit the baby Jesus, and they had honored him with their gifts, and then they were visited by an angel who warned the Magi not to tell Herod where the baby Jesus was. Now, when Herod doesn't hear back from the Magi, he gets pissed off, and he orders that the slaughter take place, that all the 2-year-old and younger boys in Bethlehem be killed. Jesus escapes this slaughter because Joseph was warned by an angel in a dream. Matthew's account of the slaughter definitely reads more like a myth than like a description of a historical event. Finally, if you weren't starting with the assumption that the Gospels were reliable, would you really conclude that this act of state-sanctioned mass infanticide, for which there is no evidence other than this lone reference in Matthew, a reference that also describes the involvement in the event of angels, had actually happened? I don't think you would. I think the only reason McCrae has to make this argument, and in fact the only reason to make most of the arguments that we find in the case for Christ, is that the possibility that the Gospels are wrong has already been eliminated. And the Gospels just aren't worthy of that level of trust. Next, the riddle of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain no information about Jesus himself, but John McCrae tells us that the Dead Sea Scrolls do offer some insight into who Jesus claimed himself to be. McCrae mentions a scene from Matthew chapter 11, verse 3, where Jesus is asked directly by 2 disciples of the imprisoned John the Baptist whether or not he is the Messiah. And instead of just saying yes, quote, "Jesus answered and said unto them, Go and show John again those things which ye do hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he, whoever shall not be offended in me." And that's Matthew chapter 11, verses 4 through 6, that part I just read. So, in saying this, Jesus is paraphrasing chapter 35 of the book of Isaiah, but he adds the bit about the dead being raised, or at least that's what it looks like he's doing, because McCrae says there is a manuscript that was discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls that includes a section of Isaiah that includes that phrase, "the dead are raised." So, according to McCrae, this is confirmation that Jesus' answer to John the Baptist through his disciples was really a long-winded way of saying, yes, I'm the Messiah, what the hell did you think I was? And Strobel says, quote, "It was staggering to me how modern archaeology could finally unlock the significance of a statement in which Jesus boldly asserted nearly 2,000 years ago that he was indeed the anointed one of God." Why would this be of any interest to anyone other than someone who was seriously into biblical scholarship? We knew well before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's ample evidence in the New Testament, as we have had it for hundreds of years, that Jesus considered himself to be the Messiah, and that he expected others to believe he was the Messiah as well. This discovery of this lost verse of Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is, from a certain perspective, I agree, it's an interesting discovery, but in terms of the perception, the characterization of Jesus, the ideas about how Jesus thought of himself in the Gospels, it changes absolutely nothing. And the last section of this chapter, I know, a remarkably accurate source book. Strobel compares the archaeological evidence for the New Testament to that for the Book of Mormon. And this is actually his lengthiest reference so far in the book to a religion other than Christianity. He notes correctly that there is no archaeological evidence at all for the Book of Mormon. There's no archaeological confirmation of practically anything in the Book of Mormon. There's no evidence of cities or people, no artifacts, no ancient Mormon inscriptions, no evidence that the 12th tribe of Israel became the Native Americans, no evidence that the Garden of Eden is in Missouri, no evidence of anything in the Book of Mormon, no evidence that the Book of Mormon is anything other than something that Joseph Smith just made the hell up. But the New Testament, on the other hand, according to Strobel, quote, archaeology's repeated affirmation of the New Testament's accuracy provides important corroboration for its reliability. So let's review what archaeology affirms about the New Testament, according to McCrae and Strobel in this chapter. It affirms that the people who first told these stories, the Gospels, were familiar enough with the region in which these stories take place and in which they all lived to get the details of place generally correct. Cities and towns that are mentioned did actually exist where they are said to have been. Rulers and other government officials mentioned were also real people. And as I said before, this certainly does not hurt the case for the reliability of the Gospels. But this archaeological corroboration by itself doesn't help the case either. It just maintains it at zero. What are we to do about what archaeology doesn't confirm? What am I talking about? Well, there is no archaeological evidence of Jesus himself. There's plenty of evidence for his following, for the religion that grew up around the stories about him. There's no archaeological evidence for Jesus himself anywhere. There's no artifacts, no tomb, empty or not, no references to Jesus anywhere that date to his own lifetime. There's no archaeological evidence for his birth, for his youth spent in Egypt, for his ministry, for his miracles, for his death, or for his resurrection. Everything we know or think we know about Jesus comes from sources that are secondhand at best. And this wouldn't be important if it weren't for the incredible nature of the claims made about Jesus. Without better evidence for the man himself and the feats he supposedly performed, there is really no reason to believe that any of these miraculous events actually happened, no matter how good the evidence is for the incidental details. And the evidence for those incidental details isn't nearly as good as McCrae and Strobel would have us believe, as we've just been discussing. A fellow YouTuber of mine, JJ Philly LG, commented on my previous video in this series, and he summed up the argument that Strobel and McCrae are making here as good as I've ever heard it. And he says, quote, New York is real, therefore Spider-Man is real. At the end of the chapter, Strobel does not ask McCrae how his work has affected his personal faith. For the first time, I'm not sure why he left that out, but I will go out on a limb and assume that McCrae's work has strengthened his personal faith. It's just a strange feeling I have that that's what he would have said. So that's the end of this chapter. That's the end of the scientific evidence. Next, chapter 6, the rebuttal evidence. Is the Jesus of history the same as the Jesus of faith? And I'll tell you right now, it's the most dishonest chapter in the book. So look forward to that. Thank you all so much for watching, for keeping up with this series, for subscribing, for supporting the channel and my videos. I really, really appreciate it. I love hearing from you guys. Any questions, comments, arguments, whatever, are always welcome. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.